For a room this size, I don't typically use a microphone, so it's going to be a little bit kind of like, got a slide clicker in one and a mic in the other hand, but we'll figure it out. Thanks everyone for coming. So the introduction probably doesn't need to be repeated, but just to, I guess, set the scene for you, Business Models Inc. has been around since about 2008 and is headquartered over in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. I'm going to run you through the way that we do things and also the things we work with. The canvas, as everyone is relatively familiar with, is just one of many tools. And what I aimed to do in this talk is give you a little bit of background as to where some of those tools came from and the history and how they were created. And then also walk you through some of the new tools, the methodology that's published in the new book, but also give you a bit of an experience in using some of these tools as well. So you, as Patrick kind of indicated, there's a little bit of work to do, but it's not really a workshop, and I understand that everyone is giving up their evenings and also from different organizations, so we're not going to be spending a whole hour working through a problem. I'm just going to give you an introduction to some of the tools and how they work, so you might be able to take them back with you. So really, Business Models Inc. plays in these three domains, the three biggest buzzwords of 2016-17, design, strategy, and innovation. What does that mean? Well, I think a little bit of history is probably a good thing to understand. When we talk about strategy design, that's one of the fastest rising job titles these days, strategic designers or strategy designers, or people are starting to apply design thinking in a strategic concept or understand and access strategy through design methodologies. And really, what we're looking at here, of course, is a portmanteau of two separate concepts. One is strategy, which is really just understanding how to empathize and recognize the distinctiveness of different things so that we can influence their behavior and ultimately be superior. Strategy is kind of predicated on conflict. You can go all the way back to Sun Tzu if you want to, but we're not going to be leaning too heavily on the old cliches. And then you've got design, and for all the designers in the room, of which I'm sure there are many, you're probably familiar with Buchanan's 4 orders of design. So this conceptual hierarchy between types of designing and the types of design process that go along with the outputs. So communication design, object and artifact or industrial design, service design where you're dealing with interactions, and then systems design where you're starting to understand the complexities and the interrelatedness or the relationships between complex problems. And then, of course, along came design thinking, which is really this way of taking the designer's mindset, as Tim Brown would say, and applying it to a whole host of other problems, whether it's just general creativity or problem solving or problem defining. This understanding of the ways a designer works became hugely popular in the late 90s and early 2000s. And so strategy design started to come closer and closer together until it became one actual term. And so we see that quite a lot now, and we never really stop to think what it actually means. In fact, when you think of all of the different language and lexicon that goes along with strategy design, there have been numerous types and factions of kind of innovation theory that range from Google Sprint to Agile to Lean Startup, running Lean, DevOps, design thinking, human-centered design. Everyone has their own flavor and language for it, and really, when we start to think about the differentiation and the confusion that those different languages actually generate, you come to understand where Business Models Inc. is situated and why we came to exist in the first place. So obviously, the name gives away a little bit about who we are and what we do. We're a Dutch firm. I don't know if anyone has Dutch heritage or knows Dutch people, but they are a very literal, and I say this very lovingly, a very literal people. So we were involved in designing this thing called a business model canvas. We wrote a book called Business Model Generation. There's this one, if anyone's seen it. And so we called the company Business Models Inc., because that's what we do. We do business models. So if you think about what a business model means, what is this term, where has it come from? We're not talking about business models, of course. We're talking about the conceptual term business model, and it's actually quite a recent thing. We don't really stop to recognize how new it is. In fact, it really doesn't even get said in both academic or non-academic literature before the 90s. Can anyone take a guess why from around 95 we just had this kind of exponential explosion of interest in business models? .com boom, yeah, absolutely. What else? What drove the dot-com boom? Internet, yeah. How do we access the internet? Web browsers, computers, yeah, absolutely right. Windows 95, bloody Bill Gates. So as soon as computing became something that was much, much more accessible to the masses, and I'm not saying that Windows 95 was the first time that really happened, but it was certainly a major explosion in adoption and also sort of synchronization of the tools and technologies that people were using. We started to see this massive explosion of interest in the conceptual term business model. And it's not just because of 95, but it's actually because of this thing that everyone was able to do with their computers and their desktops. They're starting to use spreadsheets in a much faster way than they could have used before through the Office suite to adjust the calculations and all the inputs and outputs that go into the business. In fact, start modeling different business scenarios. And so as a result of that and all of the confusion and jargon and blah, 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 and different business plans and everything that came out of that, there was a need to try and understand what people meant when they said the word business model. And because as you saw before, it's had a massive explosion in usage. Everyone was saying the words, but of course they were meaning different things. And that became the subject of Alex Osterwalder's PhD in 2004, 2005. So at the time, he was writing an article, or a whole thesis really, on business model ontology. So understanding the knowing of, the knowledge behind business models. And at the time, our Dutch founder, partner, Patrick van der Pijl, was working for a Big Four company in the Netherlands and had a weekend habit of reading PhDs. I don't know why. Don't ask. But he came across this PhD that Alex had published and he became very interested in it. And so they decided to go and set about writing this book. Patrick saw there was a lot of opportunity in the new knowledge that Alex was generating, and Alex was very interested in starting to codify the concept of a business model and looking at what those fundamental constructs were when people used different language, what were they actually getting at, and what did they really mean. Now, everyone knows, or most people know, the business model canvas, and for those of you who don't, there are a few little handouts on some of the tables, and it's sure to be in those. But just so you're, I guess, aware of the significance of the tool, since its publication, it's reached approximate global search parity with terms like strategic plan. So people look for the business model canvas almost as much as they look for strategic plan, well, when they're searching things on Google, that is. Now that's significant because when you look at the way that people execute strategic plans and you look at the evidence behind the successfulness of executing strategic plans, there's a really great study that was published by HBR and The Economist which showed that it's really only about 63% of all strategic initiatives that actually achieve what they said they were going to achieve. That is terrible when you think of the fact that about 40% of all strategic plans don't get where they say they're going to go. What's the point in having them? What's the point of even doing it? No one's even reading them, probably. And when you look at what the most common, I just realized you probably can't see the laser on the TV, but when you look at the top 2 reasons why these initiatives fail, the number one is, of course, we didn't have enough time or resources. That's what everyone says. But after that, it was a poorly communicated strategy, or it was hard to adopt, or we didn't have the right actions in place. They weren't clearly defined. We didn't know what to do. In some research that the guys, Alex and Yves, did on the adoption of the business model canvas, what they realized was those were the things that people were actually using this tool to do. Because it's one page, it's 9 building blocks, it's very simple and visual and very easily communicates the systemic nature of value creation, you were able to get, as it were, people onto one page where you could clearly communicate how your organization creates, delivers, and captures value. And then out of that, start setting up slightly more logical and straightforward plans about what we need to do to move from business model today, times 0, to business model 1 in the future. Now, we didn't stop there, of course. In fact, there were a few books that have been published since. Some of you will be familiar with value proposition design, which was really a follow-up to the business model canvas. And if you were to think about the theoretical constructs, it probably should have come before business model generation, because in the way that it was launched to market, as soon as everyone got their hands on the business model canvas, they started looking at the middle of it and they saw this column that said value proposition. They're like, what the fuck is that? It looks fantastic. We want a value proposition. Surely our products go there. Or we just put our services in there. Or question mark. And that's not what a value proposition is. In fact, for those of you who are familiar with the great Clayton Christensen, he talks about this theory called jobs to be done. People don't buy products and services, they buy jobs that they need to get done. They buy solutions. They hire products and services to get jobs done for them. And when you start thinking in terms of jobs to be done and the pains that people experience or the obstacles that they might experience in getting that job done, you can start to see why a certain product or service or the way in which it's delivered is valuable for that person. So value proposition design really kind of unpacked what we mean when we talk about human-centered design and when we actually start to develop personas and customer journeys, what's actually involved in getting to that real core insight about what creates value for someone. And then, of course, a value proposition is nested within a business model, which tells you how to create that value, how to deliver it to the market, and how to capture it in a way that generates profit. As we were starting to develop these theories of strategy design and these tools, we started to see some patterns emerge in the way people adopted them or took them up and used them. We also started to see some gaps in our understanding, but also in our process. Now, because we started from a base of codifying the language and trying to get at a common definition for what we actually meant, it became sort of part of our nature to try and codify best practice in a way that could be like the canvases. And that's really the subject of the third book, Design a Better Business. This is the whole innovation process from beginning to end, and we like to call it a handbook for uncertainty, because I'm sure you've all heard at least one talk in the last month that leans on the military acronym VUCA. That is kind of business status quo now. It's the start of almost every business strategy talk. It's a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world, and we need new tools and techniques to deal with that. Now, of course, that actually is true. Like, I'm not saying that just because it's a cliche doesn't make it true, but the whole principle behind strategy design and design thinking as a way of accessing strategy is that it makes it easier and more repeatable and faster and more fluid for you to deal with those kinds of uncertainties. Because if you think about writing a plan and then starting off on that journey that you've neatly planned out in logical order, generally, as Mike Tyson would say, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. So it doesn't work. We often find that business plans don't survive their first contact with the customer. That's Steve Blank. In fact, the whole concept of business planning is starting to disappear out of popular business rhetoric. And this is because, as Ijikura Nonaka says, and he's one of the authors and sort of original theorists behind codifying the Toyota lean way, the Toyota way, that knowledge is in fact born in chaos. So what we often try to do in business is codify things and make them simple and de-risk them and make them predictable. But in fact, what that ends up doing is it locks us off from any new ability to create new knowledge or generate new value or do something different or innovate. It creates functional fixedness where we see the problem only through the lens of the specific thing that we're doing, the specific way that we're solving the problem today, and we start to ignore or even not even see the future opportunities. So Design a Better Business and the tools and techniques of strategy design is what I like to call choreography of thought, or an understanding of how ideas move. I personally believe that there's a very direct relationship between the way that you think and the quality of the ideas that you have. And so if you start to adopt this idea of the experience of strategy and the way of doing strategy, the way of thinking, and start to think of thinking as not just a conceptual abstract thing, but something that moves. And we know from neuroscience now that thoughts, are just chemical, electrical activity. They move around our brain. And similarly, as we develop new insights, that sets us up in the right way to create new opportunities. So this choreography of how we go about solving problems is important. And of course, there are a number of different ways and popular ways of choreographing these ways of thinking. We know of Stanford's design school kind of empathize, define, ideate, prototype, test. We know the UK's design council's 4D, discover, define, develop, deliver. There's the lean sort of learn, build, measure loop. And the double loop model that sits at the core of Design a Better Business is no different. It's a process like many others. It's a choreography for thinking about strategy. We don't propose this to be a replacement, but what is important is for you to understand the different ways that people go about doing the same thing and the variety of different language that's out there. Now, if you start to think about the way that different types of people or different professions or different disciplines think, you can also start to understand how these types and tools and techniques and ways of doing strategy can be deployed in different industries, and how different kinds of businesses can adopt these tools as well. There's something to be gained from understanding the interdisciplinary nature of knowledge just as much as there is from the sort of strategist's way of thinking. A strategist is kind of a bit of an everyman. A good strategist shouldn't just be a business strategist or a design strategist or a creative strategist. They should be able to understand strategy in all of its manifestations. And so it is truly an interdisciplinary art form. And this is actually a theory that's starting to get developed now through MIT's Journal of Design, where they start to look at taking the metaphor from biology. I don't know if anyone remembers the Krebs Cycle from their grade 9 biology classes. Anyone? Yeah? All right, you want to explain it? always say that. So I'm gonna totally mash this too, and I was hoping no one would say they understood it, because I don't either. But the whole concept of the Krebs cycle is it's the metabolization of energy in a cell. It's the system by which a cell creates energy and ultimately then divides and does what cells do. Now, if we start to think of creative energies or knowledge in the same way, we can start to think of the relationship between different ways of knowing: arts, design, science, engineering, and the application of those fields in culture or in nature, in the more abstract or the more concrete, the perceived and the produced. We can start to realize that, in fact, we don't just generate new knowledge by staying and going really deep in one domain. We generate it by cycling through the domains. So we need to understand, and we need to have ways, and in fact we need to have a language for understanding why and where and how we jump off and we move through those different domains, and ways of solving, ways of knowing, ways of understanding problems. So the idea really behind the most recent book, Design a Better Business, is to create this process to help you understand, innovate, and validate. And repeat the process, of course, because if you're standing still these days, you are in fact going backwards. But the validation part is probably the most important part, because innovation in and of itself is a really overused buzzword, but really everyone intuitively knows what it means. We all think, we all at least aspire to improve our lives, to invent new ways of doing things, to make things better. And that's all innovation is. It just exists along a spectrum from improving what we currently have to inventing something completely different. But in a business context, you have to raise the stakes. You have to take a scientific mindset to the way that you are innovating, to test your assumptions, to actually validate whether what you thought was going to happen actually happened. Because if you just say, we'll see, then you're always going to be right. Something will happen, you'll see it, but it might not be the thing you wanted, right? So, why are we here tonight? Well, I think one of the things that's really important as a takeaway is to start developing this experience of strategy as an experience, to go through some of that choreography, to start breaking down the mindset that you can write down the idea in a plan and expect that to come true. We really don't want the output or the takeaway from today to be to go and have a meeting about it, or to go and think about it a little bit more. I want you to feel confident, or at least inspired, to actually go and do something. The tools are all relatively easy. They all can fit on one A4 page. You can pack a few in your bag. And so the more open you are to adapting to your current surroundings and changing the way that you work and just agitating things just a little bit around the peripheries, I think all the better for you. It's going to set you up for success, and hopefully set up your businesses for success as well. So of course, as I said at the start, and I'll repeat it again now, to get to this better understanding of strategy as an experience and the concept of strategy design, we actually need new tools. We need new mental models that can enforce and develop this mindset of what strategy design is. And of course, as we start to learn how to use these tools and develop them for our own businesses, we need new skills to develop our proficiencies at doing it, because everyone starts out as a beginner. Even the people who produce, master symphonies, they started playing someone else's music. They didn't just wake up one day and compose a symphony. So these tools can help you develop that common language for strategy design and actually start to integrate it into your work. So what is it that I'm actually talking about? What is in Design a Better Business? Well, as I've mentioned already, the whole backbone of the book really exists from this journey that begins before we even start an innovation effort, before we even start a business perhaps. How do we actually prepare for the journey rather than just assume that we're ready and start the journey? What do we need to do before we even begin? How do we prepare? And follows that journey all the way through to scaling, which is the sort of unicorn goal that everyone has in mind. How do we take the business through that trough of disillusionment, or how do we get from 5 people as a startup to 40 people as an SME? Sort of how do we solve that problem of scale? And of course, as we all know, the design squiggle, it's never a clean journey. But we're hoping that by breaking it down into at least a few key stages, you can iterate your way through that mess. So, of course, after you've prepared the team and you've set about your expectations and goals and your team charter, as it were, for who's going to work on this project and why are we organising in the way that we are, you need to adopt a point of view. Now, this is different language from a vision or a mission, because your point of view is actually a story about the way the world is changing and the direction the world is heading in, where humans are moving, how they're relating to one another, what that actually looks like. And so there are a number of tools, there are 4 in fact, that some of which we'll use in a moment, that can help you unpack your point of view. What is your vision for the future, of course? How do you tell the story of that future? And how do you take from your definition of the future a design criteria for what choices you're going to make and how you're going to invest in that journey as you go? Some of the tools, of course, are the 5 Bold Steps Vision Canvas, the Cover Story Vision Canvas, and the Storytelling Canvas. So these 2, the first 2, the 5 Bold Steps Vision Canvas and the Cover Story Canvas, these are tools that you can use to help you define what you see the future as. These were tools that we actually developed with a good friend of the firm, David Sibbett. Some of you might be familiar with his work through the 2 books, Visual Meetings and Visual Teams. David Sibbett's actually considered one of the grandfathers of visual thinking and graphic facilitation. And his mental models or ways of organising a page to communicate the idea in a visual way are actually very old, in fact. Much of them are already published in sketch notes in Visual Teams and Visual Meetings. And you can see them, of course, in the new book in a slightly more refined fashion. So if we start to think about point of view and what your point of view actually is, these 2 tools, the Cover Story and the 5 Bold Steps Vision, can be quite useful. So what I wanted to do is just pause for 5 minutes and let you have a conversation with a couple of the people nearby or around your table. Take either one of the printed versions or a piece of blank paper and a pen. And if you've got a blank page, just draw up either the Cover Story or the 5 Bold Steps Vision. And just over the next 5 minutes, I'm not going to facilitate this in a sort of structured workshop format, but what I want you to start to think about is what you see as the future of your business, and how do you start to think about the key ideas, the themes of that future, what's going to either support you or challenge you in getting to a future state, and how might you start to develop an understanding of what that future looks like so that you could communicate it to someone else. So this is conversational more than anything else. I appreciate you're all from different businesses, so you may or may not have a common story to tell. But I'd like you to just start thinking about the future. What's the future look like in your world? If you don't have one, just take a blank piece of paper and just draw one up. depends on. Can I? And then we do like startup accelerators and as well. So I don't know if anyone knows the Foundation States, we design their accelerator program. We've also designed policy for government, design their innovation ecosystems policy. Some of that's a little bit more traditional research, but it's a bit of a mix. But yeah, happy to do like Q&A. Just gonna exhaust your tables and move on. Your vision of the business. Okay. Hopefully you had some really nice conversations. I've dropped into a few tables, and I might just do a quick clarification and just wrap, I guess, in sense of why we would use these two tools and how they're different. So as I said to a few of you, the cover story vision is much more of a narrative construct. It's you imagining what your business would be on the cover of, say, Time magazine for. Why would people be reporting on your business? What would they be saying? What is it that you've done? And how can you imagine that future state? But not just in an abstract way. How can you anchor it to specific details? What did you do? If they were interviewing you and asking you for the bottom line information, did you get X return on Y, or what was the specifics financially or percentages, or what were the numbers attached to it? You can start to understand where you think that business is going and also the level of your ambition. The 5 bold steps canvas, on the other hand, is a little bit more abstract. That's a tool that helps you understand the world, and you would use it in accompaniment to a tool like the cover story. The context canvas, context map. The context map would usually be used before one of these vision tools. So to give you an overview, I guess, of some of the tools that might be interesting to you, we're dropping in at a few different points around the loop, but the sequencing of how they'd be used in practice is a little different. You start by looking at the world as it exists today, what's happening in the economy, rules and regulations around your business, what are the big uncertainties, what are the technology trends, and which of those things are the most important to you. And then you would use either a tool like the cover story or the 5 bold steps vision to start anchoring it, and then saying things like, if technology is going in this direction, or if the rules and regulations of our industry are going to be like this, we think, in the next 5 years, how does that impact our vision of the future of our business? So we start on the outside at the top for the 5 bold steps. We start to think of just general ideas about the future. They start to consolidate into themes, and those themes then help us articulate what we think the future is actually going to be. Now, we don't just have to make up a sentence where we try and stitch those 5 themes together into one paragraph. We actually just want to look at how does that help us understand what the future actually looks like. Because a good vision statement shouldn't just be hyperbole, it should actually be what you think the real future of the world is going to be and how you show up in it. Now, elements of that future are going to either support you or challenge you, and if you've only got 5 steps to take between now and then, you're going to have to think quite bold, and you're going to have to choose things which are going to expose you to a bit of risk or break the status quo or do things a little bit differently. So it kind of forces you not to either be too small that nothing changes and you just perpetuate status quo, and not too big that you can't do anything with it. So if we start to think about the relationship between the tools, we can start to understand that using a tool like the context map in accompaniment to the 5 bold steps vision can help you to select the elements of your understanding both the world and the future of the world to inform your design criteria. Now, this is how you start to, I guess, formulate problem definition. You're currently exploring the problem space, and you're starting to understand a little bit more about where you think your business is going, and you need to start making choices. The design criteria is quite simple. It helps you articulate what you absolutely must do, or what you must respond to in the context. Because if you're not designing for the real world, what are you actually designing for? So there are elements in that world that you absolutely must respond to. There are also some things which you could respond to, but you've got to make a choice on limited resourcing and time. So what are the absolute non-negotiables? And what are similarly the things that you absolutely will not do? So you start to rule things in, you start to rule things out, and you also start to understand the opportunity space. So what could we do and what should we do, but we're going to wait until we've done the things we must do. So how do you actually make choices with the information that you get out of these tools? Absolutely. So you're starting to define the world and the future of your business and start to make choices about what you'll do. So this starts to inform what happens after the moment. Because typically, those 2 activities, if you were doing the context map and the vision canvas, that would take you about half a day, on average. Like, you should be spending between an hour and a half on each tool in your business. If you try to do it faster than that, you just won't get it done. You won't have those critical conversations. You won't explore it fully. It'll feel rushed, and people who are in that experience with you will feel unsatisfied. So that'll take you about half a day, and that starts to set you up to understand what your current business is actually like. If you've never done it before, this is where you'll start to formulate the business model for your business. It's also where you can start to use things like persona mapping, customer journey maps, value propositions to start unpacking what you currently do today. Of course, in this lens of understanding, this is where you use those tools to develop understanding of what you do today. It's not generating new ideas, although you can use those canvases to generate new ideas. But that's a tool, that's a whole set of tools that comes after you know how your business works today. Because as I said before, innovation is kind of just existing along a spectrum from improving to inventing. So if you don't actually know what you do today, then you don't have any chance of understanding what you're improving or if you're creating something that already exists. And as I mentioned, the value proposition it should be thought of as a nested tool, so it doesn't exist separately to a business model. It exists within a business model, but it can be designed separately. So you do the value proposition and then you build that in to your business model, and that helps you understand how separate value propositions might interplay with each other. In the case of a platform business model like Uber or Airbnb, you have people who can switch between roles. They can be a host, they can also be a customer of Airbnb, they can be a driver, they can also be a rider. It's the same person, different value proposition. Value proposition design, as you know, comes out of most of the theoretical work of Alex Osterwalder, so he was a big contributor, of course, to those tools. And some of the other tools, which you may or may not be familiar with, include things like the empathy map. So if anyone's started to explore user experience design, persona mapping, you might have used a tool called the empathy map. That was developed by a guy called Dave Gray at a company called X-Plane. Empathy map's in the first book as well, but some of Dave's new tools, including the culture map, are not currently published in any books, but they exist within the tool set. So the culture map is a tool you can start to use as well to understand the cultural mechanisms of your business. So you can look at the business model and the functional relationships between activities, partners, costs, revenues, channels, relationships, value propositions, etc. But we all know that just because it has a good business model doesn't mean it has a good organizational culture, such as Uber, for example. So the culture map can be quite a useful tool to help you examine how the business actually works by looking at the outcomes that you're getting and what behaviors are attached to those outcomes and what things might either enable or block those behaviors from occurring within the business. And then you can start to, at the micro level, make choices about what you need to do to either enable good behaviors or block the bad behaviors. So I think everyone heard what the question was, but for the benefit of the recording, the question was whether or not there's a reason for using a persona instead of jobs to be done, value proposition design kind of methodology. We don't have a philosophical point of view on which you should or shouldn't use. Suffice to say, the aim behind Design a Better Business is to codify all of them. So start bringing what was previously quite disparate language between different types of innovation theory and unify them under one framework. However, you're right, a persona tends to be a made-up thing that is kind of post-it noted to death and may not actually exist in the real world. However, what a persona can be useful for is starting to inform the unique experience if you start to apply more of a design anthropology layer to your understanding of your customer. What are the unique experiences, meanings, and motivations that underpin a particular person? and how might they inform their experience of a pain or an obstacle? How might they inform their ambition and therefore the stated goals and gains that that customer might have? So it can actually differ quite a big amount, even if you're looking at the same jobs to be done, depending on the context and the unique individual. So the persona can be useful for that, but yeah. So that should start to set you up, of course, to understand how to generate some new ideas. The ideation process, the innovation process is kind of like the secret Szechuan sauce of all innovation activities. There are a myriad different ways of coming up with new ideas. Some of those can be quite simple categorization, just general, huge, going for quantity brainstorming and then consolidating down into themes and patterns. I think there's a new variation on a theme now called brain swarming. Has anyone seen that? Yeah, it's where you don't just brainstorm because everyone gets groupthink. You start to look at the problem and then you re-engineer all the components of that back down into the component parts. And so if it's like the old think outside the box metaphor where the box was actually part of the solution, but because we have functional fixedness, we only think of the tools in the box as what we can use to solve the problem. So ideation is really just a structured way of taking loose conceptual maybes and light bulbs and converting them into something which is either going to help us make an impact on the business, and it could be a big impact or a small impact, or help the business or the business model generate new revenue or reduce its costs. There are some pretty simple mechanics at play there. If we come up with a new idea, how is it either going to help us drive new revenue in or take cost out of the business? So we can start to categorize them across these 2x2 grids and make choices on what we want to focus on. And as you start to build up your set of tools, the toolkit that you use within your organization, you'll start to see in your own mind different agendas for how you might organize your workshops, how you might work with your teams, starting with context mapping and vision mapping, working down into business model understanding, generating new ideas, coming back the next day to generate a variety of new possible value propositions and business models, and then starting to anchor that into some strategic choices. Now, once you've gone through that first half, the first loop of the double loop, you've prepared your team, you've adopted a point of view, you've defined how your business currently works today, and you've started to generate some new ideas, that might actually change your mind. It might change your point of view. You might have come up with an idea which was completely adjacent to the space that you thought you were playing in. And so it's useful, of course, to learn from that iterative experience and see how that might change your point of view, redefine it perhaps, before you move on to the next stage of prototyping and validating and testing. Has anyone read Playing to Win or familiar with Roger Martin at all? A couple of people, yeah. Good HBR readers. So Roger Martin's Playing to Win theory really sets about these 5 questions of strategy, which are what define good strategies from bad strategies. It starts with, what are our winning aspirations? What are our goals? Now, you can use a tool like the 5 Bold Steps vision to help you articulate what your winning aspiration is. Where do you see the business in the future? What are your goals and how are you going to get there? As you start to unpack your winning aspiration, the next most important strategic question is, where do we play? Which markets do we operate in? How do we position ourselves in those markets? And you can start to understand where you play using the right-hand side, the front end of the business model canvas. Which customer segments do we serve? Which value propositions? Which channels? Which relationships, etc. The last 3 questions are, how do you win in those markets? What capabilities do you need? And what systems need to be in place to support that? Now, it's very important, actually, when you think about the choreography of those questions, to answer them in that order. Because often what you find with businesses, particularly big businesses, is they go the other way. They start with a systems change problem. We need a new CRM, we need to fix the website, we need to get a new blah. Spend all of their money changing the system, and then they realize that no one can use it. And so they only need to train everyone on the system and run a huge capability initiative. And then they've run out of their additional sort of overdraft budget, and they still don't understand how that system is actually going to help them win in the markets they play in, let alone whether they're positioned correctly, let alone whether that aligns to their overall ambition, their why, the purpose behind their business. So it is important to go the top down, although not top down, but you know what I mean. Start with winning aspiration, define where you play, understand how you win and set yourself up for success, and then you'll understand which capabilities you need to build to make your organization successful. And of course, you can apply the sort of 3 lenses of human-centered design to the business model canvas as well. You can understand the overlap between desirability as a function of how well you understand the customers, their jobs to be done, and what value you actually offer them, whether it is feasible for you to produce in your current business configuration with the resources and the activities that you have, and the partners that you utilize to do those things. A partner in a business model sense is not just someone that you like to work with, but it is someone who provides a resource that you don't have or performs an activity that you can't. That is the definition of a partner in the business model sort of language. And then, of course, the viability of it. Can you make more money than you spend? So this helps you to understand and therefore prototype these different ideas. And you can use a variety of tools. There are a couple in the book. One's called the Prototyping Canvas. But there are many others. I think even Luma has, I can't remember the actual name of it, but it's the matrix of features and functions. Creative matrix. So prototyping is probably in the book one of the leanest chapters, in the sense that there aren't as many codified canvases for prototyping, because that's not what you're prototyping. Like the artifacts of the strategy process shouldn't be what you're selling to your customers, right? It should actually be the product, the service itself. So prototyping it by actually making it real is taking it off a page, not putting it on one. And then, of course, what comes after that is the scientific approach to validating that and actually testing your assumptions. So the validation part of the process is where we started to work and collaborate more closely with people like Steve Blank, who some of you may be familiar with. He's regarded as kind of one of the real titans of innovation theory in the States, and his investment readiness level, which was really just a thermometer analogy that he was using to articulate technological adoption of different businesses, like NASA even. What was their technology readiness in terms of the types of things they were rolling out and the investments they were making? And if you translate that back to what are the key questions that we need to answer to determine investment readiness or readiness of any kind of technology or product or service, of course, starts with a basic understanding of whether or not you know what it is. So have you defined the business model for it? Have you defined the value proposition? Have you actually taken it off the page and created a minimum viable prototype? Have you shown evidence for problem solution fit? Have you gone one step further to product market fit? And the top level, sort of level 9 investment readiness, is where you start to get metrics that matter. So metrics that matter are very different across very different industries, but you can start to examine things like, cost per acquisition for your customers, the things that are not just vanity metrics like your revenue, but the important metrics like your actual profit. Because you can be a company like Amazon, which has huge revenue, but very, very thin profit margin. And that's not necessarily always repeatable. Other tools which are important in the validation journey are the actual definition of experiments. What is it you're actually testing? So this is where we worked with Ash Maurya, who's the author of Running Lean. Many of you may know as well. One of the tools he was starting to develop a few years ago was this concept of the experiment report for a build, measure, learn loop, and what key questions you need to understand in order to effectively define an experiment. So what is the assumption, first of all, that you are testing? What is your falsifiable hypothesis? How do you actually articulate and design a test which is going to capture real data against that hypothesis? And what is your significance threshold? How do you know that you're correct? Because you can have defined the hypothesis quite well, you can have done the test, but if you're wrong 50% of the time, is that good enough or not? And so as you actually start to develop this understanding of the experiment design process, you can start to set up, I guess, across a wall or however you want to do it, even just on Trello, which experiments are in process, which ones have been validated, invalidated, and you can start to think in more of a systematic way about how different elements of your business model might have been developed, validated, implemented, or trashed, invalidated, and moved back into the ideation process again. So this kind of closes the loop for the double loop. Of course, at the end of the prototyping and validating journey, we come back to point of view because we might have been wrong. Everything we developed, all the prototypes we might have put into market might have failed. We might not have passed any of the tests that we set ourselves. And so it makes sense to return back to our fundamental assumptions about where we're going, because that might have been leading us down a garden path. So we change our point of view and then we move back through the cycle again. We understand what this new business model is based on our revised point of view. We develop some new ideas, we prototype them, we validate them, test them. And if we're right, then we can start to scale them. So the whole DBB toolbox, as it were, is in the book, but it's also available online. Like the business model canvas, all of these tools are in the Creative Commons. We don't make any money from selling them. We don't even make money from the sale of the book, really. Wiley does. But that's not as important as the adoption of them. What we would really love is for you to be using the tools and giving us feedback on how they can be improved and edited and changed and revised. You can see that there's quite a few coming soon tools that are being added. And really what we think of as Design a Better Business is not the book, but like business model generation, a community of practice which can bring together the various different ways of thinking about innovation, generate new tools, define and design a common language for strategy and innovation. And that's what we're really excited both to share and to have you share with us as well. So the 7 essential skills really are keeping it simple, being able to tell a story, embrace uncertainty because that's just part of life. Think visually, don't fly solo, so do this with a team. Set up experiments, be prepared to test yourself, challenge yourself, and be scientific about it because that's going to provide you with the fundamental truth that you need when you pitch your idea or you try to raise investment. If you can show investors real data about how you proved or disproved what you believed, it's not just your idea, it's truth, if you believe in scientific method. So where that leaves us, of course, is, I guess, an overarching narrative about the journey of design and these ways of knowing. And when I talk about choreography of thought, that is a very specific story that I like to tell about the way we work in design and as strategy designers. And I quite agree with this quote by Henry Doss that if innovation occurs as a result of culture, and culture is a sum of narratives, then innovation directly descends from the stories that we tell. So how do we design a compelling story? How do we tell a better story about the work that we're doing? How do we bring people along on the journey? Once we understand what the future looks like and we can clearly define our point of view, how do we tell a compelling story? Well, I thought the last activity we could do, and this is really the end of the talk, so we'll go from this into more drinks and more conversation, is to start thinking about how to tell better stories. The storytelling canvas is one of the tools in the point of view section of DBB, and it's architected really around that sort of common 3-act structure. But what it adds is this understanding of both the audience of the story and the goal. And this is something that we often forget, or perhaps we just take for granted when we're designing both internal presentations or pitch decks or whatever the case may be. We often don't think about what we want to achieve from telling this story. We kind of just take it for granted. And similarly, perhaps worse, we don't think about who we're presenting it to. And so the way we tell the story and what we include or what we exclude is going to be different depending on who you're talking to, of course. So if you can define those two things, and of course define what the story is about, the subject of the story, you should be able to clearly articulate or understand what is happening in the world of your audience before you tell the story. What do they currently know? How do they currently act? If you start, does anyone remember Joseph Campbell's monomyth, The Hero with 1,000 Faces? Really great book, a bit dense, but awesome theory. He talks about this kind of unifying structure behind almost every story that's ever been told. It's called Star Wars. Yeah, absolutely. But it starts with the hero in status quo, the world as it is today. It generally always opens with introducing the protagonist in their world. Then there's some kind of call to adventure. and maybe they meet a mentor, or maybe someone, offers them a challenge, and maybe they refuse the challenge at first, and then they kind of get hit in the face again, and so they accept. And so they kind of cross over this liminal space between the world as it is today to this new special adventure world, and then there's a few challenges along the way. Maybe they fail, they try again. There's a supreme ordeal, which is kind of like the climax in terms of dramatic arc of the story. And then they return with elixir. They've had some sort of insight, or they've been transformed, and they come back into the original world having changed for the better, or just changed, full stop. Now, of course, that's a very elaborate and perhaps somewhat abstract and ridiculous way to try and convince your senior management to invest in this new project. So you can simplify it and just use a storytelling canvas instead of the hero's journey. What's important, though, is you understand what the world looks like today, so you can understand how to change it. So you set the scene for them, you tell them about what we currently know, and then you make your point. And this should be really the aha moment of the story. It's how you've taken an understanding of the world as it is today, and you've shown how it could be different, or how through this conflict we can generate some new knowledge, and then you make your conclusion. And so therefore we must overcome this, or we must do that. And that should be something which kind of clicks in your audience's mind. It shouldn't just be you saying it. It should be them arriving at that idea through the excellent choreography of your storytelling. They should have that feeling for themselves and want to, therefore, do something after you've told the story. So comparing before and after states, you can determine whether or not your story has been successful in achieving its goal. But you need to define that before you begin. So I'll leave this up because I think this would be a really useful way for you to both think and talk to each other about what you do over a drink for the next however long we've got. Yeah. Yeah, of course. I was going to say. Yeah. Yeah, so it's interesting actually. Guess how many possible patterns there are in a business model? Yeah, it's a 9 factorial. It's over 360,000. So yeah, we have done work with the business model patterns. Do you have a particular one in mind, or? So the way we would typically use the patterns would turn up in an exercise we call fresh watching. So typically turns up in the innovation moment of the journey. And the reason for that is when you're working with an executive team, or whichever team it is who's dealing with this challenge, and you're trying to get them to move outside their current way of thinking, fresh watching is the tool. It's really what we mean by that is looking at other business models or other business model patterns with fresh eyes. So how would we run our business and still be Isobar, for example? How would we still be Isobar if we were running a bartering model? How would we be running Isobar if we adopted a razor and blade business model, where we sell the handle quite cheaply, but the blades are replacement blades? So that pattern for that business model is something that we need to incorporate into both our value proposition and our customer channels and relationships. But we still have to be Isobar, not Gillette. So that's where it would typically show up, is to try and break your assumptions and think more broadly. But you can also use it, of course, like in a fictional way. You can architect context layers and vision layers around all of those different patterns if you wanted to. There would be, if there was the right kind of data analytics platform on the back end. Yeah. Yeah. Strategizer as a web platform has got quite a way to go. Alex's whole point of view is to codify, not necessarily to control. In fact, the platform that you do want to be looking at if you're interested in that micro-level insight into people's business model data is Xero, because Xero actually do have a searchable database of everyone who is on Xero. They just can't surface it in a way at the moment that doesn't breach every privacy law that ever existed. But they've got it. Yeah, they do have it. The thing that relates to your question as well about patterns is the way in which the business models change. So we haven't done it yet, but it's certainly on the horizon for things we're interested in, is kind of monitoring, I guess, creating an index of the ways business models tend to change. Whether people, and this is somewhat true of the innovation trajectory in general, businesses tend to launch with a value proposition advantage. They do something that other businesses don't do. And then as they scale, they create customer advantage, where they have the ability to control and manipulate and understand their market better than their competitors or the new incumbents in that industry they created. And then as they scale further, they develop resource advantage. And that's where you can start to get efficiencies of scale. You can manipulate your supply chains. You can consolidate. It's what we're seeing in almost every facet of business today. Everyone talks about disruption, but the major business pattern of today is consolidation. Businesses are being bought far often than they're being pushed out of the side. And so, of course, though, once you get there, that's the sweet spot. That's the inflection point to start again, to disrupt yourself. And that's, under Steve Jobs' leadership at least, what Apple did really well. They kind of moved from computing into mobile computing into software and application, iTunes, the application layer, and then so forth. So as soon as you start to get to the top of the curve where you are competing on cost, that's typically where you start to enter decline. So you need to either disrupt yourself, invent something new, acquire a different business, and move off again at the top. A really good question, and remember when I said that the prototyping section is the lightest in terms of canvases, because it's not, the aim is not to finish the canvas, the aim is to make a business and do something. Yeah, yeah, exactly right. So that's where methodologies or sort of end-to-end processes like Google Sprint, that's actually quite a good way to break down people's assumption that doing the tool is the primary objective. But of course, this is one way of doing things. Where we as a firm operate is half in this codifying thought leadership, writing books and talking about strategy from a point of view of tools. The other half is what we actually do to make money and keep the business turning over every day. And this is more in what we would call a venture design space. So of course we consult to people. We work with people on understanding their business models and helping them change it. But increasingly what we're doing now is working with founders and working with organizations to sort of launch adjacent ventures. And instead of having our strategy designers work on a tool, they're actually just working on the business or a business with other businesses. Yeah, of course. But I don't know if anyone's familiar with the MG Taylor way. Does anyone know Matt and Gail Taylor? Does anyone know PwC's The Difference? Yeah. Or maybe, I don't know what KPMG called it, EY called it something else, Capgemini called it something else again. It's kind of done the rounds. But MG Taylor Way is another codified way of thinking about creative problem solving. And as the name suggests, it was designed by two intellectual hippies, Matt and Gail Taylor. And it is codified down to where the pot plant goes. Like that's part of the whole way that they architect the space. And what they focus on rather than tools, and this is quite interesting because we've seen a couple of conversations between Matt Taylor and Dave Sibbett. Dave Sibbett's one of the designers, the mental model architects behind a couple of these tools. Dave is all about the visual mental model and architecting that space for you to think within. Matt is completely the opposite. He's kind of like nah, man, don't put any boundaries around it. Just get drunk, let's do it. And it's a completely different way of thinking, but they achieve the same things. Of course, you do have to have that critical appreciation of the meta level process. And so it's great to hear that as a question, because that's, if you start thinking the tool is going to solve your problems, you're mad. The tool is just going to help you unpack what's already in your head. It's the grammar for innovation as opposed to the sentences. How do you get executives to think? Is that the question? Have you got on that? Yeah, look, I think the most important thing is before the process even begins. So it's creating the right authorizing environment. It's setting people's expectations to be taken a little bit out of their comfort zone. It's very difficult to, the Einstein quote, solve our current problems with our current way of thinking. So really all we attempt to do with these tools is to take people wider and then narrow them down again. So generate new ideas, filter those ideas, implement those ideas. But the permission that needs to be in place for them to even do that from the first instance usually takes a lot of engineering before you even start. So like, for example, look at companies like Cisco at the moment and look specifically at how Chuck, their CEO, is architecting a permission structure around a thing called chill. So that's a way that Cisco thinks about multi-party innovation, where they can actually bring their customers in to solve problems with them. That's where you'll start to see real leadership in terms of how executives are pushing the boundaries of what they think and how they think, and also creating or giving everyone in their organization the permission to think differently as well. Because it can't just come from down on high. Like any strategy that's kind of handed down to the team is kind of up against it from the beginning. So that's why we say it's strategy as an experience. It's got to be something that everyone does, so that the pendulum is not swinging too far just to the thinking, but equally it's not just doing stuff without thinking about it. You have to be going through that process. Both. Yeah, so the business model is just, although it has lines which block off boxes from other boxes, it should be thought of as a systems diagram. So the definition that Alex proposed for a business model is the rationale that explains how an organization creates, delivers, and captures value. The creation of value happens on the back end with the resources and activities and partnership mix. The delivery is on the front end, relationships, channels, customer segments. The capture is underpinning on both sides. How do you capture the value through revenues and capture the costs in a way that you can sort of offset them, hopefully. But in principle, it doesn't have a time frame. Like, it's equally valid to use to understand how what you do today is done and how to do something differently in the future. What's absolutely important is that you don't have both timeframes in the same canvas. Yeah, because as soon as you do that, you break the space-time continuum. And I don't have to tell you what happens then.